Now, in business environments, we're more likely going to be dealing with domain user accounts, and so we want to understand the management of those. As an IT professional, it could be part of your responsibility to set up new accounts. It really varies based on the scenario. So some organizations are not going to, have level 1 support doing that. Other organizations, that will be one of your tasks. This doesn't mean you're an Active Directory administrator. The larger the organization, the less likely, at least at the entry level, that you would have that function. But the creation of user accounts can really be done by anybody who's in IT, who's been trained on how to create the account. The only difference is where the account is being created and then the level of access that it's going to give. So, it very likely could be something that you need to know, practically speaking, and it's definitely something you need to know from the exam perspective. Okay? These domain-based environments and user accounts will provide multiple benefits. A domain provides better scalability, technically up to millions and millions of objects can be stored in a domain database. It gives you centralized administration of all of those objects since the database is contained on domain controllers. Your Active Directory administrative tools will just simply point themselves to a domain controller, even if you're running it on the local system, and allow you to manage that database. That database is the same across multiple domain controllers. You can have 50 domain controllers and they all have the exact same database. You add a user on one and the process of replication is going to make sure that all the other domain controllers have that same user listed. That means the users can log on hitting any domain controller, but that means from a management perspective, we can always open up an Active Directory administrative tool and we can be connecting to a consistent database. It also supports delegation of control. As you might imagine, these domains can get very large, so we have a component known as an organizational unit, which is within the domain environment, and the OU can hold users and computer objects and groups and other organizational units, and so you could then delegate administration to that OU. And an OU might represent, say, a particular city in which you have an office or a particular division or department, and so control can be delegated at different levels within Active Directory. So you have better control, you have better event logging when you're in a domain-based environment. From a login perspective, the login events are going to be centralized on the domain controller, so it gives you better security. You also have group policy, which we haven't mentioned yet. We will later when we start talking about enterprises. This is centralized configuration management, which is included in Active Directory. It's incredibly powerful. Basically, if you can modify the registry to achieve some setting, then you can use group policy to do it. But group policy is often a much easier way of doing it, and it consists of setting up a group policy object and linking it to an Active Directory container, like a domain or an OU, and then the settings within that GPO are going to affect everybody in that container. More on that later. Domains also provide what's called SSO, or single sign-on access to resources. And so authentication is really just step one. I got to know who you are, but I'm knowing who you are, I'm validating your identity in order to then authorize you to access resources. Well, when you're using a local account, that identity is only valid on that system. You cannot use that identity from computer 1 to access resources on computer 2 because computer 2 is unaware of that identity. In a domain, we don't have that problem because in a domain, you're validated by the domain controller, and assuming computer 1 and computer 2 both trust the domain, in other words, belong to the domain, then the access token you're given using a domain account is valid across both systems. So you get single sign-on. Now, that doesn't imply that you will have access to every resource that you try to access, but it does imply that you will not be asked to authenticate again. Okay? You authenticate once, you validate who you are by username and password, usually, and then you can use that identity to attempt to access resources without being asked to log in again. That's what single sign-on is all about. There are some additional requirements, as you might imagine, for Windows 10 to be able to join into a domain environment. Of course, the domain has to actually exist, and that means you have to have some Windows servers Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2 would be ideal, but of course 2008 R2 would work fine as well. These are machines that have the Active Directory domain services role installed on them, and a domain has been created. Now, if you're in an existing environment, that's kind of a moot point. A domain will exist. Now, secondly, you have to be able to locate a domain controller. The location of a domain controller is performed via DNS, which provides name resolution in a Windows network as well as out on the internet. So your client is essentially going to send a query to its preferred DNS server requesting a domain controller for domain X, whatever domain I've specified. Assuming that the appropriate records are in DNS registered by the domain controllers, then that should work just fine. This is really only an issue if the domain has just been set up. Otherwise, if you've been up and running, then DNS should be working just fine. Okay? You do have to be a local administrator. In order to modify the domain membership of a computer, you have to be more than a standard user. And you do have to have a permission. It's called the permission to add workstations to the domain. Now, this is a right. It's a permission or right that is actually granted to any domain user by default, although some organizations will change that. So it's possible that you need to be an administrator in Active Directory in order to be able to add workstations to the domain. The norm is that anybody who's a member of the domain users group can do it, and so therefore, if you're a local admin, then you can add a machine to the domain because you have that user right, add workstations to the domain. That user right gives you the ability to add up to 10 machines to the domain. So if we ever find ourselves in a scenario or see a scenario on the exam that has a user adding more than 10 machines to the domain, then that's just a giveaway that user right is no longer going to suffice. We're now going to have to directly give this person the permission to add computer objects to the domain. Okay, if you have the permission to add computer objects, then you can add as many as you want. Okay, or it's not add, it's create. If you have the permission to create computer objects versus the user right to add workstations to the domain. To add the computer to the domain, the standard old way would be the system properties. You can also use the Add Computer PowerShell commandlet, sort of a new way, and then the Settings app would be the newest way. Any of these ways, it is going to require the computer to be restarted to actually finish that process of joining the domain. All right, so now we're going to just take a look at a demonstration where we walk through the process of joining a Windows 10 system to the domain. Okay, as we've discussed, you've got different ways of doing that. One is in the Settings app, in the System area, down in About. Then you have the ability to join or rename. Okay, again, you could just say you want to join a domain, and then it would have given me that option. So we can click on Join a Domain. We're going to specify the domain name. I've created a domain there called Knockerball. Administrative name and password, and then we would hit OK. Now I want just to show you, I'm just going to open up the command prompt here, just to show you what we've got. This is my current configuration. If I go ipconfig all, then what we're going to see is I've got a DNS server, and this DNS server is the domain controller for the domain that I am trying to join. Okay, so I have already configured the information that's going to be necessary in order for me to communicate with that machine. Okay, so we said the domain has to exist, you have to be able to locate the domain, and then it's going to be joining it. Okay, now at this point it says you need the info for the person who will be using this PC. If you skip this, then they'll have the default permissions for the domain. So what's the user account? Basically, you are specifying a domain user account. So we'll say administrator. Then we're going to restart the PC, and then it restarts. Okay. So that's the process for joining the domain using the Settings app. Now I'm going to get in here and minimize this. I want to show you something over on the server, just so we can see, just in case, what is necessary to locate this server. So here's my KB DC1. We've got the knockerball.com domain or the zone. You've got a record referencing the domain controller, but this is not the most important one. The most important ones are found over here in this TCP folder. These are what are called service records. And these service records identify the fact that KBDC1 is a domain controller for the knockerball.com domain. All right? And so Kerberos is the authentication, KPassword, password changes. LDAP is just, it's lightweight directory access protocol. It's the primary protocol of Active Directory. And then global catalog. So these are the records that are registered by the domain controller in its own domain, and that's what the client is looking for when you go to join the domain. Okay? Let's minimize this, get back into Windows 10 here. Now you see I'm joined to that domain, so I can log on as the administrator account for Knockerball. And it's the first time that that's logging in. So we will get the infamous, hi, we're setting things up for you. And this just happens every time a new profile is created. So when you log on as a domain account, you are logging on to the computer. So therefore, there has to be a user profile that's created for you. And so what's happening during this process is that you are getting a copy of the default user profile. It's setting up a local profile for that domain account. Okay? Once that's done, we get the desktop. Now let me show you over on, let's open up just Windows PowerShell. In Windows PowerShell, we'll be spending a little bit more time on this later, there is an add computer commandlet. So the add computer commandlet can be used to join the domain. So I'm just going to go help add computer dash examples. Okay. And looks like we're going to have to go update help and let it go through and do the updates. This was a new thing from Microsoft where they don't have all of the help content. In fact, they have very little of the help content actually installed by default. And so you have to go through and update, and you should then periodically do that. And the reason that they're doing that is so that you're going to a central source to get the updates, and they don't have to worry about all of the help files being ready to go when the operating system is released. Instead, the individual teams can work on their own help files, they can update them, and at any time I can run update help and then get the, go to the source and get that content, okay? So as I said, we're gonna go through PowerShell greater detail later, but I wanna download this help content now and just show you how you'd use this add computer commandlet to join the domain. We just need to, there we go, okay. So now we'll repeat that command, help add computer with some examples, and it's pretty simple. Add this computer to this domain name and restart, okay? Or add it to a work group, add it to a domain with a particular server. This is adding the computer and putting it in a specific OU, okay? The credential that you want to use. So I would know this one. You are adding this particular computer, the local computer, to a domain or work group, and that is the simplest way of doing it. The restart switch just tells it to forcibly restart. Old way was the netdom command line utility, netdom. You're not going to see that anymore most likely, but the PowerShell add computer commandlet was new in Windows 8, and so this is relatively new still. That's one that's going to be beneficial. Reason being, I saw one of the examples, this for instance, adding a computer name, and then you're grabbing the content from this text file. So basically at that point, it's actually adding multiple computers to the domain. All of the computers that are listed in the server's text file. And it's a little different because it's doing a Windows 9X upgrade, but the point is you could get a list of computers and you could then remotely add them to the domain. So that PowerShell can be very beneficial for more automated processes, all right? So that's the way you join it to the domain. You do have the standard system properties as well. If you use the control panel option to join a domain, then you are going to you would see just the way that it has been for many, many versions. So I focused on the new ways of doing it, but you have to join a domain in order to be able to log into a domain using that domain account on Windows 10.